Thought moving into a quiet apartment would be a fresh start, until the knocking began. 3 knocks at exactly 12:07 a.m., a voice whispering my name, and shadows that shouldn't exist. Now I know the rule: too late never, ever open the door after midnight. Mara had always loved quiet nights, but that was before the knocking started. 3 sharp knocks at exactly 12:07 a.m., echoing through her empty apartment. A childlike whisper calling her name, shadows that moved when no one was there. At first, she thought it was imaginary, but when the scratches appeared on her doorframe and the voice began speaking inside her own mind, Mara realized the truth. Something was waiting behind her door. Something patient. Something hungry. And the moment the clock strikes midnight, she knows she must never open the door. The first knock came at 12:07 a.m. Mara sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor of her new apartment, laptop balanced on a crate that served as her makeshift desk. Around her, cardboard boxes slotched against faded wallpaper, the smell of old varnish clinging to everything. She was too tired to unpack, but she couldn't sleep either. New spaces always kept her awake. The knock was not loud. It was soft measured. 3 times she froze. The hall light outside her door flickered as if on cue. Delivery. She whispered, but she knew there was nothing to be delivered at midnight. 3 more knocks. Same rhythm. Mara crept toward the door, bare feet silent on the wood. She pressed her eye to the peephole. Nothing but the empty hallway stretched ahead, the far exit glowing with a weak exit sign. Another knock, closer this time, almost against her ear. Hello. Her voice cracked. Who's there? Silence. Then a whisper, faint but distinct, please let me in. The voice was small like a child's, but the hallway was empty. She backed away, heart hammering. Her grandmother's old superstition flickered in her mind. Never open the door after midnight. Not if you want to stay whole. The whisper came again, dragging across the wood like breath. Please. Mara turned, grabbed her phone, and snapped a photo of the door. When she looked at it, the photo showed something pressed against the door, pale fingers splayed, a smudged face peering through. But when she looked up, the hallway was empty again. The deadbolt rattled. Mara bolted to her bedroom, slammed the door, and spent the rest of the night curled under her blanket with the lamp on. In the morning, she convinced herself it was exhaustion, stress, maybe a prank. But at 12:07 a.m. the next night, the knocking returned. She didn't know it then, but this would be the first of many nights that would end with a whisper at her door, and a nightmare far worse than anything she'd ever imagined. Mara had never been fond of moving. The ritual of packing, hauling boxes, navigating narrow stairwells, and unlocking the door to yet another unfamiliar apartment always left her drained. But this time was different. She had promised herself a fresh start, a small studio at the end of the quietest hallway in a building that had stood since the 1960s. A place where she could finally write, paint, and live without interruption. It was 11:30 p.m. when she finished unpacking the last box of books. The smell of old wood and varnish lingered, giving the apartment a strange, timeless scent. She sank onto the floor, surrounded by stacks of novels, a laptop balanced on a crate she'd used as a makeshift desk, and her journal open to a blank page. She wanted to write tonight, to capture the excitement of a new beginning, but her body refused. Fatigue weighed down every limb, yet sleep eluded her. Then came the knock. It was soft, deliberate, and 3 knocks long. Mara froze, her pulse spiking. She glanced at her watch, 12:07 a.m. Her apartment was at the very end of the hallway. The walls were thin, and the quiet made every sound unnerving. She held her breath and leaned forward, pressing her eye to the peephole. Nothing. The hall was empty. The dim exit sign cast a sickly green glow at the far end, but no shadow moved, no figure. Mara exhaled slowly, forcing herself to laugh. Probably a prank, she whispered. Some neighbors trying to scare the new girl. 3 more knocks followed, exactly the same. Her laughter caught in her throat. She stepped back. Her grandmother's old warnings echoed in her mind. Never open the door after midnight. That's when they come looking for someone. Mara had always laughed at it as a child. A tale meant to scare her into obedience. But now her heart pounded like a drum, making her question every decision that had led her here. Who's there? She called, her voice trembling. No answer. Just silence, heavy and oppressive, like the air itself had weight. Then came the whisper, please open up. The voice was small, delicate, almost childlike, but the hallway remained empty. Mara pressed her back against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the floor. Her thoughts raced. Could it be a child? Someone lost? She gripped her phone, contemplating calling the police, but even the idea felt absurd. A prank, her imagination, something worse. Another sound joined the whisper, a soft scraping along the doorframe. Mara stiffened. It was slow, deliberate, almost measured. She wanted to flee, but curiosity and terror kept her rooted. Her phone's flashlight illuminated the peephole. She snapped a photo on a whim, an almost ridiculous act of courage, and glanced at the screen. What she saw made her gasp. In the photo, pressed against the door, pale fingers splayed, a smudged face peering through the peephole. Eyes wide, hollow, and staring straight at her. When she looked up, there was nothing. Her pulse raced. She backed into the bedroom and bolted the door. Even through the door, she could hear the faintest scratching, like nails testing the wood. She grabbed the baseball bat from under her bed and held it close. She didn't sleep that night. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the old floorboards, seemed amplified. Morning brought a false sense of relief. The hallway was empty. Nothing had moved. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe a vivid imagination. Mara told herself she would laugh at it in the daylight. But night came again, and at 12:07 a.m., the knocking returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. The whisper followed. Please let me in. Mara pressed her back against the wall, clutching the bat like a lifeline. She considered leaving the apartment entirely, but the thought of moving again, of facing the hallway in daylight seemed impossible. Instead, she did what she did best. She observed. She watched the door, the hallway, the dim glow of the exit sign. Her phone rested on a crate beside her, recording sound. Her rational mind screamed that nothing could enter without a key, without a handle turned. Yet the fear gnawed at her, deeper than any rational explanation. Hours passed. The knocking stopped. Mara stayed awake until sunrise, sitting in the corner with the bat pressed to her chest, listening to the silence. By the third night, she discovered something else. Faint scratches along the edge of her doorframe. They hadn't been there before. They looked deliberate, intentional, as if someone, or something, had tested the door in the hours when she slept. A neighbor, Mrs. Holloway from 3 floors below, noticed Mara's pallor and asked if she was all right. Mara hesitated. The thought of telling anyone, letting them think she was losing her mind, made her shiver. She nodded politely and moved on. But in the quiet, she could hear whispers. Always whispers. She searched online, tried to find information about the building. Nothing concrete. Only old forum posts mentioning missing children, midnight knocks, and weird occurrences. Each time she read one, her skin crawled. But the rational part of her brain insisted she was chasing ghosts. And then came the dreams. At first, they were vague shadows moving at the end of her bed. A child standing in the corner, whispering her name. Soon they became clearer, more sinister. The child's face, pale and smudged like in the photo, appeared closer each night. Her voice, soft and pleading, followed Mara everywhere, even when she woke. By the end of the first week, Mara understood she could no longer ignore the door. Whatever was outside wanted something. She didn't know what, but she knew it would not stop. And that was the night she learned the rule she would never forget: never open the door after midnight. The morning after the third night, Mara tried to convince herself it was just exhaustion. After all, it was easy to let her imagination run wild when she was alone in an unfamiliar apartment. But the scratches on the doorframe refused to be rationalized away. She ran her fingers along them again, tracing the jagged edges, noting the way they carved into the wood as if someone, or something, had been testing the barrier between her and the hallway. She felt a chill despite the summer sun streaming through her window. Determined to get answers, Mara went downstairs to see the building manager. Mr. Carmichael was a wiry man in his 70s with a permanent scowl etched into his face and the faint smell of cigars clinging to his clothes. "Morning, miss," he grunted. Mara Whitman. "I just moved in on the 5th floor," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I noticed something strange in my apartment. Scratches on the doorframe. I just wanted to ask if there's anything I should know about this building." Mr. Carmichael squinted at her, his eyes narrowing. Scratches. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh that sounded like it carried decades of secrets. "Well, old building. Doors swell, frames shift. Nothing to worry about." Mara hesitated. Something about the way he said it didn't feel right. She pressed further. Has anyone else had problems, unusual experiences? The old man leaned forward suddenly, his face grim. Listen, kid. This is probably none of my business, but whatever you do, never open your door after midnight. Just don't. The words hit her like a cold wave. What do you mean? He shook his head, exhaling through his teeth. I've lived here 50 years. Seen things, heard things, people vanish, especially the kids. Don't ask questions, don't open doors. Midnight's when they come calling. Mara laughed nervously, trying to mask the shiver crawling up her spine. Vanishing kids. They've vanished. Always around here. The police never figure it out, nothing shows up in records. And the apartment, it seems to hold on to them, or at least the memory of them. You're young, you'll understand one day. The warning was vague, almost cryptic, but Mara felt her stomach twist. I thank you. She left the office, mind racing. The building's history had suddenly become far more sinister than the scratches or the knocking. Something was following her, or waiting. She didn't yet know which. Back in her apartment, Mara tried to convince herself she was imagining things. But that night when the clock struck 12:07 a.m., the knocking returned. Louder this time, more urgent. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. And then a voice. The same childlike whisper she had heard before. Please, open up. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the lock. But her grandmother's warning rang in her head, stronger than ever. Never open the door after midnight. She held the bat tighter, pressing herself into the corner. Then she noticed something new, faint, almost imperceptible shadows moving across the hallway floor. Not her own, and not caused by the flickering light. They stretched and twisted, defying physics, as if the hallway itself had warped in the dark. The whispers grew louder, repeating the same pleading line over and over. Mara tried to speak, to reason with it, but no words came. The fear gripped her like ice, immobilizing her. Then the doorknob rattled. The deadbolt clinked against the frame. She was certain it was locked, yet something on the other side tested it with unnatural persistence. Panic surged. She grabbed her phone and began recording. Maybe she thought she could capture proof. Evidence. Something rational to explain this madness. When she replayed the footage in the morning, her blood ran cold. The doorframe in the video appeared warped, almost alive. Shadows moved independently of the light, and the whispering voice could be heard. Unmistakable, pleading, human yet inhuman. The next day, she tried to reach out to neighbors, hoping someone else had experienced something similar. But every resident she spoke to either denied noticing anything unusual or refused to speak at all. One young man, a delivery worker, seemed uncomfortable just mentioning the 5th floor. They say some apartments here people change after moving in. Don't know what that means. I don't stay after dark. He muttered, hurriedly walking away. Mara was alone, increasingly isolated, and her nerves frayed with every passing hour. She began to notice small things, items, subtly moved from where she left them, faint footprints appearing on the dusty floor, a soft smell of damp earth that lingered only in the dead of night. She started keeping a journal, recording every knock, whisper, shadow, and anomaly. Patterns emerged. The knocking always began precisely at 12:07 a.m., never earlier, never later. The whispers never left. They became louder, more insistent, more desperate. And the shadows, they grew bolder, reaching further into her apartment each night. It was in the 3rd week that Mara discovered the first of the notes. A small, folded piece of paper tucked under the crack of her door. The handwriting was childish, messy, barely legible. Don't open. It waits. Midnight comes. Run if you can. Her hands shook as she held it. This was not her imagination. Someone, or something, had left this for her. By the 4th week, sleep was a forgotten luxury. Mara could no longer ignore the whispers creeping into her mind, even during the day. She began to see fleeting shapes in mirrors, reflections that weren't hers, doors that weren't fully closed when she remembered locking them, hallways stretching farther than possible. Her friends tried to convince her to leave, but she hesitated. There was something compelling about the apartment, something that drew her, and even as it terrified her, she felt a connection to whatever haunted the 5th floor. And she feared that leaving would not end it. One evening, as she examined the scratches on her door again, she noticed a faint pattern. Not random, but deliberate, a series of symbols, carved deeply into the wood. They seemed old, older than the building itself. She could feel a dark pulse emanating from them, a sense that the door was more than just wood and hinges. That night, as the clock ticked toward 12:07 a.m., Mara braced herself. The knocking began as usual, but this time the voice whispered her name. Clear, urgent, terrifying. Mara, let me in. The shadows shifted. The floor beneath her creaked unnaturally. The air grew cold. And in that moment, Mara realized something terrifying. The thing on the other side of the door was not waiting for her to open it. It was learning, growing, becoming stronger with her fear. She gripped the bat, heart racing. She could run. She could flee the apartment. But the whisper followed her everywhere, calling her name, pulling her back. And she knew with a certainty that froze her to the bone. If she opened that door, she would never close it again. The night seemed colder than usual. Mara had taken to sleeping fully clothed, bat at her side, lights on, recording app running on her phone. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Every shadow in the corner, every subtle creak of the floorboards, held the weight of something unseen. It was 11:50 p.m., 17 minutes until midnight, but she was already alert. Her eyes flicked toward the door, her ears straining to catch the faintest sound. She could feel it waiting, patient, calculating, watching. Then the knocking started. Not 3 knocks this time, but a slow, deliberate tapping, almost like fingernails drumming on wood. Mara froze, bat raised, trying to steady her shaking hands. The whispers followed, a soft, almost melodic repetition. Mara. Mara, come to me. She pressed her back into the corner, willing the floorboards to remain still beneath her. Her apartment seemed to shrink, walls creeping inward, shadows stretching unnaturally. The clock ticked, louder than it should have, each second a drumbeat of terror. She reached for her phone and started recording again, hoping to capture something, anything, that could prove she wasn't losing her mind. But as soon as she turned it on, the whispers stopped. Dead silence. Then came the footsteps. Slow, dragging across the hallway floor outside her door. Each step deliberate, impossible to ignore. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't see them, yet she could feel their presence. Heavier than air, oppressive. The knob rattled. The deadbolt shook. The whispers returned louder, more insistent, weaving into her mind. Mara, open. Let me in. The voice had changed. No longer childlike. It had grown older, deeper, colder. It was still pleading, still human, but with something underneath, something alien. Mara gripped the bat tighter, standing on instinct. But her legs trembled. She realized, with horror, that she hadn't moved from the corner. She was trapped, paralyzed by fear. As the entity outside tested her resolve, she remembered the note left under her door days ago. Don't open. It waits. Midnight comes. Run if you can. But how could she run when the apartment itself seemed to conspire against her? The lights flickered, shadows dancing like twisted marionettes. The hallway outside her door elongated, stretched impossibly, as if the building itself had become a maze. And then something new. A face, pale and hollow, appeared at the peephole. Not just once, but constantly shifting, morphing. Sometimes a child, sometimes an adult, sometimes something entirely inhuman. It stared at her with eyes that seemed to pierce into her soul. Mara stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. Her mind screamed for reason, for logic, for sanity, but none came. She could feel it, the presence outside, testing her, learning her fears, shaping them into weapons. She remembered Mr. Carmichael's warning, never open your door after midnight. But she had never imagined it would be like this. She had never imagined the apartment could hold something so alive, so intelligent, so malevolent. Her thoughts raced. What did it want? Why her? Why now? The scratching on the doorframe grew louder, almost musical, as if it were trying to communicate, to convey meaning she couldn't yet grasp. She pressed her ear to the door, heart hammering. A whisper, almost beneath the threshold of hearing. You're next. Mara screamed, swinging the bat against the door. The sound echoed through the apartment, mingling with a scream from outside that sounded uncannily like her own. The knockings, the whispers, the dragging footsteps, all stopped. Silence. For 10 minutes, she waited frozen, listening to the emptiness, her ears straining for anything. Then, slowly, she realized the door was moving. Just slightly, a tiny shift, almost imperceptible. Something on the other side was trying to get in without a key. The fear that had been simmering inside her exploded. Mara ran, grabbing the notes she had collected, her journal, anything that connected her to the outside world. She left the lights on and paced the apartment, muttering to herself, trying to remind herself that this was real, that she was awake, that she wasn't dreaming. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, the rapid pulsing echoing through the apartment like a drum summoning something unseen. And then she noticed the shadows. They weren't static. They moved with intent. They slithered along the walls, crept toward her, flickered just out of reach, as if testing her reaction. One shadow in particular lingered near the door, taller than a person, stretching and bending unnaturally. Mara picked up the bat, her knuckles white, and whispered to herself, "I will not open the door. I will not open the door. I will not open the door." But the whispers persisted, now inside her head as much as outside. "Mara, open, please. We can be together." Hours passed like minutes. Dawn was far away, unreachable. Her phone had died somewhere along the way, leaving her in near total darkness, save for the thin slivers of light from the hallway. Then came a sound that froze her blood, a soft, metallic click. The deadbolt had moved. Slowly, imperceptibly, from the other side. Mara screamed, raising the bat, but the fear wasn't just outside, it was inside her now. Something had entered her thoughts, weaving into her fears, making her question reality itself. The shadows seemed to pulse, to breathe, as if alive. And then she heard it clearly for the first time, her own voice, whispering from the hallway, echoing back at her. "Mara, open the door." Her blood ran cold. It wasn't the entity's voice. It was hers. But it wasn't her. A darker version of herself, pleading, desperate, hollow. Trembling, she backed into the corner, gripping the bat like a lifeline. She could feel it watching, waiting. And she knew, with a certainty that made her stomach twist, that this was only the beginning. The apartment was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a trap. And the thing outside the door, it was patient. It would not leave. Not until she made a choice. Mara barely slept that morning. Her apartment felt alien now. Every shadow and corner holding a memory of the night's terror. The knocking, the whispers, the dragging footsteps. They lingered in her mind, persistent and insistent. Even sunlight couldn't dispel the dread that clung to her. She decided she had to know. If she was to survive whatever haunted the 5th floor, she needed answers. She began with Mr. Carmichael, the building manager. She needed more than vague warnings. She needed history, facts, names, dates. Anything that could give her a foothold in reality. But when she knocked on his office door, the old man hesitated. His eyes darted to the hall, and for the first time, Mara noticed the tremor in his hands. "I told you, kid, don't open doors at midnight," he muttered. "That's not advice you ignore lightly." "I need to know what's happening here," Mara pressed. "Why the knocking, the whispers, the shadows? People disappear. Tell me everything." "Mr." Carmichael's face hardened, his jaw tightening. He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant, and finally spoke. "This building, it's older than most remember. Built in the late 60s, but the land it sits on older. There are records of disappearances going back decades. Children mostly, teenagers sometimes, adults rarely. But those who vanish, they never return. And the 5th floor, that's the worst. The first tenants reported strange sounds, whispers in the night, shadows moving with intent. The police found nothing. It was all buried, ignored. But it never stopped. It never will." Mara's stomach twisted. "Why? What's why here?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't know if it's a why we can understand. Something inhabits the building. It feeds on fear, isolation, the loneliness of its victims. It learns their habits, tests their resolve. The door is its bridge. Never open it after midnight. Not ever. It waits, but it can't cross alone." Mara's mind reeled. The stories sounded like folklore, but the scratches, the whispers, the shadows, they were real. And now she understood the warning. It wasn't a superstition. It was survival. That night she couldn't sleep. Every second toward 12:07 am was a countdown, a drumbeat of dread. She tried rationality, barricading the door, recording sound, leaving lights on, surrounding herself with objects of safety. But she realized that rationality had limits here. The entity ignored logic. It operated outside it. The knocking started precisely at 12:07. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. The whisper followed. "Mara, open." She gripped the bat, her knuckles white. And then she remembered the old building ledger she had found in the lobby earlier that day. Bound in cracked leather, the ledger detailed tenant histories, complaints, and maintenance records. Some entries were mundane, but others hinted at the horrors Mr. Carmichael spoke of. Children gone missing. Tenants reporting voices behind doors. Shadows moving in empty hallways, all centered on the 5th floor. All dismissed as imagination or blamed on mental illness. But patterns emerged. Disappearances clustered around the same apartments, the same time of night, 12:07 a.m. The ledger confirmed it. This was no accident, no coincidence. Something unnatural was tied to this place, and it had learned over decades how to exploit fear. Mara realized that the entity outside her door was patient. It had been learning, adapting, waiting for the perfect victim. As she read through the entries, her heart sank. Many tenants had fled, others didn't survive. Names were scratched out, replaced, erased. Whispers of rituals, warnings scrawled in the margins: never open the door after midnight, it wants you, don't trust your reflection. Reflections. Mara shivered. Her own reflection in the mirror had felt wrong lately, staring back with faint movements that weren't hers. The ledger suggested this was no illusion. The entity could manipulate perception, bend reality, reach through mirrors and reflections to touch its victims. The sun dipped below the horizon, and Mara felt the cold tightening around her chest. Night was coming. Midnight would arrive, and the door would knock again. She barricaded herself, placing the bed against the door, lining up chairs, keeping the bat in hand. The clock ticked closer, and at 12:07, the knocking began. Slow, deliberate, measured. But there was something different tonight. It wasn't just on the door. The whispers came from everywhere: vents, mirrors, the floorboards beneath her. Mara, come, we can be together. The voice sounded almost tender, almost human, but the shadows moved differently now. They no longer just stretched along the walls. They slithered toward her in impossible shapes, curling and bending, following her every movement. She remembered the ledger. The notes from tenants who vanished warned of one thing: the entity adapts. It learns from your fear. It becomes part of you if you let it. Mara screamed, swinging the bat at the shadows. Her strength faltered. The entity's voice mimicked hers, echoing in the corners of her mind. Mara, open. Let me in. The lights flickered violently. Shadows danced over the ceiling, walls, and floor as if mocking her. Then, from the hallway came the softest of sounds: a single, deliberate footstep, closer. It paused outside her door. Mara's blood ran cold. She could feel it, not just outside the door, but inside her apartment, inside her mind. It was learning. It was patient, and it would wait and watch and whisper until she made a choice. And she knew, deep down, there was only one way this night would end: by surviving, or by opening the door. Mara counted every second as the day crawled toward night. She had begun marking her calendar obsessively, circling each day in red ink. Every night, the same hour approached: 12:07 a.m., the time that had become both curse and warning. She lived for the daylight now, desperate for the sun to chase away the creeping shadows, but night always returned. And with it, the caller. That evening, she fortified her apartment. Books and crates barricaded the door, the bat resting firmly in her grip. She had tried sleeping earlier, leaving lights on, running recordings on her phone. None of it had worked. Every precaution seemed only to provoke the entity further. As the clock approached 12:07, the atmosphere shifted. The air thickened, heavy and metallic. Mara's breath fogged in the cold stillness. The shadows on the walls seemed to quiver as though alive, crawling subtly across the wallpapered surfaces. Then, the knocking began. Not the soft, tentative taps of previous nights. This time it was sharp, insistent, almost angry. Each strike against the door resounded through her apartment, rattling the crates she had stacked against it. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. And then a voice. Clear, resonant, impossibly close, yet seemingly everywhere. Mara, open please. It wasn't the same childlike tone she had heard before. This voice was layered, part child, part something older, deeper, sinister. It wrapped around her mind, tugging at her thoughts, making rationality waver. Mara's hands shook. She raised the bat, but her limbs felt heavy, unwilling to obey. She pressed herself against the wall, forcing her eyes toward the door, trying to see any movement. The hallway remained pitch black, the exit sign flickering weakly. Then came the scratching, louder than ever, moving across the wood in deliberate patterns, like a language she couldn't understand. Her skin crawled. She had tried ignoring it before, pretending it was nothing, but now the sense of intelligence behind the sounds was undeniable. Something was testing her, learning her fear, adapting. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled violently. The deadbolt clinked and shook. Mara's pulse raced. Every instinct screamed to run, to escape, but the apartment seemed to twist around her. The walls elongated, shadows thickened, and the floorboards warped beneath her feet. Reality itself felt unstable. Then, from the darkness outside, she heard a new sound, a soft, melodic humming, chillingly sweet. It was a lullaby, distorted and unnatural, each note echoing deep within her chest. Her hair stood on end. She realized the entity had not only learned her fear, it had learned her memory. That song had been her mother's lullaby, sung years ago when she was a child. "Mara," the voice whispered. "Come to me." Her vision blurred. The shadows pressed closer, shapes twisting into forms she could almost recognize: a child, a woman, herself. Yet distorted, pale, hollow-eyed. They reached through the air, tendrils of darkness brushing her skin, crawling up her arms, slithering around her neck. She screamed, swinging the bat, but it passed through the shadows as if they weren't solid. The shadows recoiled, then advanced again, more deliberate, more patient. Then, she heard it, the peephole distorted, showing not the hallway, but her bedroom reflected back at her. Her own eyes stared through it, wide with terror, but not quite her own. The reflection smiled. Slowly, deliberately, Mara opened. Her mind screamed, fighting to hold on to rationality. But the voice had embedded itself in her thoughts. The shadows whispered in her ears in her own voice, "You belong with us, open the door." She realized the entity didn't just want the door open. It wanted her surrender, her consent. Fear alone was not enough. She had to break. The humming grew louder, almost unbearable, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through her bones. Mara collapsed, clutching her head, rocking back and forth. Every instinct told her to resist, yet part of her wanted to obey, to open the door and end the terror. Then, suddenly, silence. The shadows retracted, the humming stopped, and the air grew lighter, almost warm. Mara dared to lift her head. The door remained closed. No knocks, no whispers. Only the faint scratch marks, etched deeper into the wood than before. Mara's chest heaved. She had survived the night, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that the entity was changing, growing stronger, learning her patterns, her weaknesses, her fears. And next midnight, it would come again. She made a promise to herself: she would not open the door. She would survive. But even as she said it, she felt the entity's presence lingering, like a shadow behind her shadow, waiting, patient. And she knew, with a bone, deep certainty, that her life had already been changed. She was no longer alone in the apartment. Something else was there, watching, learning, waiting. Sleep had become a fragile concept for Mara. Every night she lay awake, waiting for 12:07 a.m., every creak of the floorboards or flicker of light a potential herald of terror. But exhaustion eventually claimed her, dragging her into uneasy slumber. And that's when the real horrors began. Her dreams were no longer simple reflections of fear. They were corridors of the apartment itself, twisted and endless. Hallways stretched impossibly, turning corners into loops. Doors appearing where none existed. And always, just beyond her sight, the shadows followed. It began with whispers, faint at first, calling her name, pulling her toward the 5th floor of the dream apartment. Her mother's lullaby floated through the air, distorted, warped, and layered with a sinister undertone. Mara could feel eyes on her from every corner, from mirrors that reflected not her own face, but the pale, hollow visage of the entity that haunted her waking hours. One night, she dreamt of her own bedroom door. It swung open on its own, revealing a figure standing in the darkness. At first, it was a child, small and trembling, with eyes wide and empty. Then it shifted, growing taller, limbs elongated, its smile stretching unnaturally across its pale face. The whispers followed her into the dream. "Mara, come, we are waiting." She tried to scream, but no sound emerged. She ran down endless hallways, chased by shadows that bent and twisted like smoke. Mirrors lined the walls, each reflecting her face in moments she hadn't lived, expressions of fear and despair she had never felt, but recognized instinctively. When she awoke, drenched in sweat, her apartment was silent. Yet she could still hear the faint echoes of her own screams in the corners, as though the entity had imprinted them into the very walls. Her waking hours began to blur with her nightmares. Shadows in the corners of her vision seemed to move when she looked away. Objects subtly shifted from where she had left them. The apartment that had once felt safe now felt alive, aware, responsive to her fear. She tried rational explanations: sleep deprivation, stress, exhaustion, but none sufficed. Even her reflection in the mirror began to betray her. Sometimes, when she looked, her eyes seemed darker, hollowed, haunted by someone, or something, inside her. One night after another harrowing dream, she awoke to the sound of soft knocks, not at her door, but at her bedroom window. She froze, heart hammering. The clock read 3:33 a.m., far from midnight, yet the whispers had returned. "Mara, open. Let us in." She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was her imagination. But the scratching continued, moving across the walls like fingernails tracing patterns, deliberate and intelligent. Mara grabbed the bat and slowly approached the window, but when she peered outside, nothing was there, only the empty courtyard below. The following days were a haze. Her friends noticed her pallor, the dark circles beneath her eyes, the twitch of her hands when she spoke. Mara tried confiding in one of them, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain shadows that bent impossibly, voices that imitated her own, dreams that crossed into reality? She began keeping detailed notes, documenting every shadow, whisper, and anomaly. Patterns emerged. The entity did not act randomly. It tested her, learning her routines, her weaknesses, her fears. Each night, it adapted, becoming bolder, more invasive. And each morning she woke a little more hollow, a little more uncertain of her own mind. One evening, after a particularly vivid dream in which the entity spoke to her face, Mara noticed a new pattern. The shadows were not just in the corners. They congregated near reflective surfaces, mirrors, windows, the dark screen of her laptop. They seemed drawn to them, as if they could only reach her through her reflection. Terrified, she covered the mirrors with sheets and avoided windows. But it was never enough. The whispers adapted, following her from room to room, infiltrating her thoughts, mimicking her voice, suggesting actions she never would have considered. "Mara, open. Let us in. We belong together." She began to doubt herself. Her memories felt fragmented, as though pieces were missing, replaced by moments she could not recognize. Had she really barricaded her door every night? Had she really heard the knocks? Or had she imagined them? The entity's manipulation grew stronger. One night, she awoke to find her own handwriting on a note she did not remember writing. "Open the door. It will be over soon." Her hands shook as she held it. Her own mind was being used against her. The entity had found a way to infiltrate her very thoughts, to mimic her intentions, to whisper through her own voice. She realized, with chilling clarity, that resistance alone was no longer enough. It didn't just want the door. It wanted her to surrender completely, to become part of the darkness that had claimed so many before her. By the end of the week, sleep became an impossibility. Mara's nights were filled with twisted hallways, shifting reflections, and the relentless whispering. Her days were consumed by fatigue and terror, her mind fraying under the weight of constant vigilance. And yet, she knew she could not leave, not truly. The entity had claimed the apartment as much as it claimed her nights. Fleeing might bring temporary relief, but it would not stop the whispers. It would follow, patient, waiting, always. Mara understood, finally, the depth of Mr. Carmichael's warning: never open the door after midnight. But now she realized it was not just about a door. It was about her mind, her very sense of reality. The entity was patient, intelligent, and relentless. And it was learning. And Mara had only just begun to understand the true terror of what waited for her. The apartment no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become a trap. Shadows slithered along the walls like living entities, stretching and bending in impossible ways. Mara's barricades had shifted overnight. Crates moved as if pushed by invisible hands. She realized the entity could manipulate more than just her mind. It was now reaching into her environment. At 12:07 a.m., the knocking began. It was louder than ever, reverberating through the walls, vibrating the floorboards. The entity's voice followed, layered and omnipresent. "Mara, come, we are waiting." Mara's body trembled. She gripped the bat, swinging at shadows that now seemed to have substance, passing through them, only to feel their cold presence linger on her skin. Mirrors warped her reflection, showing not her own face but a hollow, pale imitation that grinned at her mockingly. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled violently. The deadbolt began to turn on its own. Mara screamed, but her voice was drowned out by a chorus of whispers echoing in her mind. The air grew thick, choking, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Shadows reached for her, curling around her ankles, wrapping around her arms, holding her in place. Panic surged, but so did clarity. This was not a test anymore. The entity wanted entry, not just into her apartment, but into her very mind and soul. In desperation, Mara recalled the ledger she had seen in the lobby, the records of tenants who had vanished. She understood now the entity fed on fear, and submission was its tool. The more she resisted in terror, the stronger it became. The only chance of survival was control over her fear, mastery over her own mind. With trembling resolve, Mara focused. She drew a deep breath, forcing her panic into awareness. She remembered her grandmother's old teachings: fear can be acknowledged without surrendering to it. Slowly, deliberately, she whispered to herself, "I will not open the door. I will not surrender. You have no power over me." The shadows recoiled slightly. The whispers faltered. The floorboard stopped vibrating. For the first time, Mara felt a small measure of control. Then came the final escalation. The door warped outward, bulging, the wood creaking as if something massive pressed against it. A guttural, unearthly growl emerged from the other side, shaking the walls and floor. Mara raised the bat, ready to defend herself, but she knew it wasn't enough. Physical force could not stop this. She focused again, steadying her heartbeat, controlling her breathing. She visualized her boundaries, imagining a protective barrier surrounding her, separating her from the entity. The growl became a wail, a scream of frustration. The door shuddered violently, then silence. Mara collapsed to the floor, shaking, but alive. The entity had tested her, but she had endured. She understood finally the truth of the fifth floor: resistance, clarity, and mental strength were the only weapons against the darkness. The sun rose slowly through the blinds, bathing the apartment in light. Mara stayed vigilant, watching the door, but she felt a measure of peace. Hard-won, fragile, but real. The entity had been delayed, weakened, but not destroyed. She knew it would return, and she would have to remain vigilant. Mara never forgot that night, nor the countless nights that followed. She continued to live in the apartment, always aware of the shadows, always listening for the whispers. But she had learned a vital truth: fear alone gave the entity power. Awareness, control, and resolve could hold it at bay. She never opened the door after midnight. She reinforced her boundaries, both physical and mental. Mirrors were covered, locks double-checked, and every night she repeated the mantra, "I will not surrender. I will not open the door." Visitors never understood why she avoided the fifth floor after dark. Friends urged her to move, but Mara had a knowledge they could not comprehend. Some doors, once opened, never close again. Some forces cannot be fought with reason or strength alone. They require vigilance, discipline, and the courage to face fear without yielding to it. The whispers never fully stopped. Sometimes, at the edge of her hearing, she could hear them calling her name, faint, patient, waiting. And she knew they would always be there. But she had learned the rule. She had survived the darkness by respecting it, by understanding its limits. And that was why Mara never, ever, opened the door after midnight. Subscribe for more videos.